briefly, before other power interests in the government wanted the FBN dissolved.
When the United States embarked on its war on drugs uh, in the early 1920s, um, uh, those early agents, and there weren't very many of them, uh, were given a task that was very unusual in law enforcement. Uh, the original Bureau of Narcotics was in the Prohibition Unit of the IRS, and of course, it was during Prohibition, alcohol prohibition, which was a different, sort of a different kind of uh, context to the war on bootleg alcohol as compared to the war on drugs. Everybody wanted a drink during Prohibition, and there was no there was really no moral uh, connotation attached to it. I mean, the evangelical movement and the uh, saw it as a sin, but a lot of politicians, a lot of law enforcement people, most Americans did not see alcohol as something that was bad or negative or morally wrong. But narcotics was a little bit different, and the techniques for making cases on drug addicts was different than it was in arresting people who were had illegal stills or were selling alcohol to speakeasies or anything like that. Political overtones involved with it, but the very nature of making a narcotic case required that required that narcotic agents create a crime. They actually had to provoke people to make a deal, to make a narcotics deal. It was very unlikely that narcotic agents would just walk out into the street and find somebody selling drugs to somebody else. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. Uh, it's a consensual crime. The person who's selling the drugs wants to sell the drugs, and the person who's buying the drugs wants to buy the drugs. So they do it in secret, so nobody can see them doing it. And this required early narcotic agents to well, again, what it's called is create a crime. They actually, through generally speaking, an informant would have to set up a sale, and then they would have to monitor the sale, watch the sale happen, document it, and repeat this scenario 2 or 3 times. The early laws, drug laws, were constructed so that narcotic agents had to make 2 buys before they could make a bust to prove intent and to avoid lawyers throwing the case out of court because you're not allowed to entrap people. So, in order to avoid this condition called entrapment, narcotic agents had to create all different kinds of ruses, and in order to get in order to be present when people exchanged narcotics illegally. And this created a whole new uh, area of law enforcement, which had never existed before. A lot of countries uh, will not allow policemen to work undercover. They won't allow policemen to perform as provocateurs in order to set people up and arrest them. It's illegal. If policemen do that, the case is thrown out of court. But in the United States, it's legal. And the federal narcotic agents, in going about and learning how set up these drug busts, had to finesse the law. Things like the Bill of Rights were obstacles to their job, and they constantly had to finesse the law. J. Edgar Hoover is famous for having said, when the United States, when the Congress first enacted drug laws, and the government was trying to figure out how to go about enforcing these laws, they went to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. And he refused to allow FBI agents to get involved in federal drug law enforcement. He said that he knew that his agents would be corrupted if they did so. And for all sorts of reasons, if you set up a drug bust and the person and you give somebody money, an informant money to buy drugs, and the informant tells the people without your knowledge that he's working for the federal government and he's setting up the drug bust, well, maybe they'll sell the informant sugar and there'll be no heroin to use as evidence. So right away, federal narcotic agents found themselves being in a position that they could be manipulated by their informants. They would give informants to set up drug busts instead of having no loyalty to the policemen who were using them. The informants could just as easily work with the drug traffickers and take the money from being ripped off by their own informants, which was not something that happened to, for example, FBI agents. So from the very beginning, federal narcotic agents would always keep a little bit of heroin in their pocket. And they would get this heroin from busts when they would actually bust somebody, and they would get, let's say, an ounce of heroin. In order to protect themselves from being sold what they called turkey at some future date, they would cut a little of the heroin that they had seized, and when they turned it in, they would turn it in at a lower percentage, and so maybe if they bought heroin that was 50% pure, they would cut it and turn it in at 25% pure, and they would keep half for themselves, and that half they could keep in their pocket, a little bit in their pocket, so if an informant ripped them off, they themselves would not get in trouble with their bosses for having lost $10,000. And that begins a whole chain of events in which federal narcotic agents realize that they're in a position where individually they can make a lot of money off the drug trade. They can actually control the drug trade itself. As investigators, they can decide who they want to set up. They can plant drugs on somebody because they now have their own little private stash of drugs. They can actually, if they want to get a mafia drug trafficker who's very elusive and they can never catch him on a wiretap selling his minions to buy a pound of heroin from French Connection, which is something that's never going to happen, and they're never actually going to be able to record him doing that. They can find out where he lives, and with this little private stash of heroin they have, they can sneak into his apartment and they can plant it there. And then they can get an informant to say, Vito or John has a stash of heroin at his apartment, and he keeps it at his television, and I know where it is because I've seen him. And then the narcotic agents can go over there and they can bust the guy, and they can make actually construct the whole scenario so that frame people so that there's no defense from what they're doing. And pretty soon the underworld knows that these federal narcotic agents have this power over them. They don't have to actually have evidence, they can create it. And pretty soon federal narcotic agents are not just setting up drug arrests so that they can cut the heroin and keep a bunch for themselves and use it to make cases. They actually go into business for themselves, selling heroin and making a lot of money. And what happened in New York in the 1950s and the 1960s is that the agents started competing with each other to make cases and also to control this little sort of
cottage industry,
the trafficking that they were involved with themselves. And in the late 1950s, through the early 1960s, the agents, especially in New York, were competing with themselves, and they were killing each other's informants. They were setting up each other's informants. There were 5 groups in New York City, and